Hello, good evening, and welcome back. Tonight we're talking about George Floyd's death and the response that has happened in the UK, which is not really reasonable, considering that more white people per capita are killed under police custody than black people, as in it is disproportionately white. But of course, what happened on the night of George Floyd's arrest and death? What made it happen? Who was responsible for the death and why it occurred? And then, of course, the American response, which has seen protesting, or more accurately, riots across the entirety of America. In 22 cities, you've had 1,600 arrests and 6 deaths because of the riots caused by the people who are not pleased with George Floyd being killed. Whether or not he was killed, though, that still remains up for debate, seeing as the autopsy actually revealed that maybe it was because of the drugs in his system and his supposed claustrophobia and the shock, instead of actually the police kneeling on his death. But tonight, for once, I'm joined by my wonderful girlfriend. Good evening.
Hello to everybody.
And we're going to be going over the George Floyd death and the response to it. So initially, George Floyd, why was he arrested in the first place? Well, the idea is that he was deciding to buy food and groceries from a grocery store. But instead, it isn't the case, as he decided to buy cigarettes instead and used a counterfeit $20 bill. When he was then in the car park, the police were called by the shop owners, and they're the ones who arrived. It wasn't Derek Chauvin, the guy who has now been arrested for murder, who arrived, but instead it was Thomas Lane and J.A. Kueng who arrived. It says they found him in the driver's seat with 2 adult passengers, according to the complaint. These adult passengers are not mentioned anywhere else in the article. Nobody else seems to care about them. Instead, it is just him. But the important point is that after he was pulled out, the holstered gun, there wasn't any need for violence or anything like that. Before he was then restrained and put to the floor, he had already mentioned that he couldn't breathe, which is a strong suggestion not just of his CHD, his coronary heart disease, but also of the drugs and intoxication which was already within his system, that he had a problem with breathing before he was then pinned down. And it wasn't as if he was new to the police, of course. They say that Floyd and Chauvin had worked together at a Minneapolis nightclub as recently as last year, but it wasn't as if Floyd was a clean man, if you will, because he had been arrested previously. They mention it in, I believe, 2009, at which he was arrested.
For armed robbery,
There
which happened in 2007, I think, and before that he served 10 months for theft as well.
So he wasn't exactly the angel that people make him out to be, but they never are. This is supposed to be one of the examples whereby he is actually a martyr for the cause, if you will, of Black Lives Matter, not that represents all black people, but instead supposed to be someone who is unarmed, not causing a threat, and yet killed. However,
Bear in mind, still breaking the law on that day.
yes, of course, and that's why the police were called in the first place. But from the autopsy reports that we've seen, it wasn't actually asphyxiation that killed him. And as we've seen in various clips of the police on his neck, for example, is that he isn't actually stopping him from breathing. And you can try this at home yourself if you wish, that if you just put your hands on the side of your neck, you'll realise that there isn't any problem in being able to speak. As I can demonstrate now, that there isn't any difficulty whatsoever. If they were to roll him onto his front, more so, and have his face pinned down and kneel on the back of his neck, then that would be difficult for the chin and the jaw. But on the back of the neck, there wouldn't be any difficulty in breathing because the trachea is mainly compressed at the front of the neck. Which is also why the autopsy report showed that asphyxiation was not the cause of death, because of course it wasn't.
And also there's no actual neck damage, which would be probably necessary if it was the leading cause of death. But also it's the fact that he was known for using cocaine, which affects the arteries and blood flow. So that could be why so many people obviously are saying that actually kneeling on him actually led to death.
In which case it would be more of the shock and the claustrophobia that he said that he had, which would have caused him to suffer and eventually die, because shock can be fatal, as is mentioned on airlines for example, from my own personal experience. But yes, that's a good point, that it isn't any damage on his neck. There wasn't any hyoid bone damage, as was, of course, popularized from Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself, and that is what you would expect from strangulation. But instead, it seems to be underlying factors. So yes, by all means, the officer brought it on, but that is why it's third-degree murder and not first-degree. That first-degree would suggest that it was more premeditated and intent to kill, whereas third-degree is much closer to manslaughter instead. Whether or not the police officer is responsible for the murder is still up for debate, but of course, seeing as we have the riots in place, then you have to do something which then appeases the people, and I believe that is why they have charged Derek Chauvin with third-degree murder. But having seen the protests, it really comes down to whether or not you think that they should be appeased at this point, because you have some mentions of saying that 80% of the people who are taking place in the riots in various cities across America actually come from outside, and they're not there because they're domestic and trying to protest against this great misjustice that has been in place, but instead are actually just there for looting shops because it's a quick way to turn a buck. And as I say, obviously it was in Minneapolis originally, but we've seen stories from people like Andy Ngo, who of course are more famous or infamous, if you will, for the Portland protests, and he himself being attacked and damaged for him trying to do journalism within Portland for Antifa protests and hitting people, attacking them, and he himself, of course, had been damaged for that. But even as far as Washington, D.C., and trying to take control of the White House, because when you've got people who are this opportunistic, then of course they're going to try that. However, if you have individual groups of people who are trying to take over the White House of the strongest nation in the entire world, then of course you're going to fail. America is of course going to try to protect their president as much as they can. And this is the kind of thing with rhetoric that Donald Trump really excels at. He is the type that will be aggressive and full on. He believes in the art of the deal, that is desiring more than you actually want to get. That the first offer you would put forward would be more than you want, in order to then try and negotiate down to what it was that you were looking for, to seem like you were conceding ground to the opposition. That is his idea. That is the art of the deal. Not something that the Black Swan group suggests, for example, with Chris Voss. But because he wants to be on a strong front, as they say here from Sky News, Donald Trump said he watched the protesters from his window, and if the demonstrators had breached the fence, to quote, they would have been greeted with the most vicious dogs and the most ominous weapons I've ever seen. That's when people would have been really badly hurt, at least. Many Secret Service agents just waiting for action. And yes, we're not a fan of martial law, of course not, but if you have this kind of level of civil unrest, the idea of the police and the National Guard, the domestic army, is to be able to return law and order to the people. And you get a response which is hoping for law and order from these riots, which then causes more people to be more right-wing because they want individualism and want to be able to protect their own property, and that is what the Conservatives or the Republicans stand for, and that is where the National Guard is therefore put into action in order to defend these people. And yet for some reason, despite this being a very Minneapolis thing, and 6 people already being killed in their riots, we've got a response in the UK for no apparent reason. Obviously they have their illiterate writing here saying white silences compliance. But also there's a disproportionate amount of white people killed in police custody.
It's white privilege to know how to spell.
Well, exactly. It's like white privilege to actually have married parents. It's white privilege to raise children who then don't want to break the law, and that's why we see gang violence and black-on-black violence so prevalent, and why we see those communities deteriorating so much, that if you actually have a cohesive parental unit, then the children fare a much better chance. Well, of course that's...
I assume that's the case.
Whoa. Let's not go down that road now. But that's almost obvious, essentially. But we've seen a similar thing when it tried to be with Heathrow, for example, and the Extinction Rebellion, and then trying to pull in Black Lives Matter into that. that it didn't get very far in the UK because there really is no grounding. But trying to suggest that US media has a strong influence on the UK is partially correct, insofar as that it's correct when you come to the broad strokes of things, but when it comes down to the minutiae of suggesting that it's racism and the like, in the UK that really doesn't hold water because it really isn't correct. And even social justice types will say that the UK is one of the least racist places you can find. And it is so anti-racist that, of course, you've got various bodies, including the Labour Party, of course, and the police in Rotherham, trying to cover up Muslim grooming gangs because they're concerned about the racism response from people. They are so concerned about being called racist themselves that they don't want to prosecute anybody who isn't white. That is how anti-racist the UK is. So trying to suggest that there are possible protests in the UK about something that happened in America is utter bullshit. And let's not forget that so many other people are killed in police custody, and for whatever nonsensical reason, George Floyd's death has decided to be put amongst everybody. And sure, the police officer acted incorrectly by kneeling on his neck instead of his back. Was he stopping him from bleeding? No, he wasn't. Does the autopsy report that? Yes, of course it does, because from what we can see, Derek Chauvin was maybe a bit aggressive in holding him down, but although he's been charged with murder, it doesn't seem as if he actually did kill George Floyd. It seems as if it was just extraneous circumstances that brought them two together, and it was the drugs in his system and CHD that actually responded in his death. But nonetheless, you can't waste a good crisis to protest, and that's what we're seeing now. So, thousands of people have gathered across central London to protest against the killing of an unarmed black man by police in the US. There have, of course, been hundreds in Manchester, but we haven't seen any of them at all. I guess they're quite quiet. But my favourite thing of all, from these protests, has been the BBC's response. Not trying to suggest that it's all racial and it's clearly only black people marching here, because of course it isn't. But instead, it is just their caption for this particular photo from Reuters, which is that some protesters did not appear to follow social distancing guidelines. Which I think is a fantastic opportunity to show everything that you need to know about legacy media. To show that when there are people protesting to say that they want to be able to live, make a living, provide support for other people, and actually be able to support their family and their households, they're then branded radicals. They don't know what they're doing. They're putting so many people at risk of their lives. And yet, when it comes to these people who are protesting George Floyd's death, then they do want to just mention, just dip their toe in the water, that some protesters, not rioters, but protesters, did not appear to follow social distancing guidelines, and yet, as we can see here, the majority of them, if not most of them, if not all of them, did not follow social distancing guidelines, despite only 5 people being arrested. 3 of them for breaking COVID-19 rules. That they clearly don't actually care. It clearly isn't an equal playing field. And how much longer must this go on before you realise that it isn't institutionalised racism against black people, but instead it's actually institutionalised racism supporting black people? It's systemic to support anybody who isn't white. That is why all of these are in place, to not prosecute people who are raping English girls, and to not prosecute people who are supporting the protest against the death of a black man by police. But instead it is just to crack down on people who want to amicably have a way of living and support their family for whatever reason. And if you want to talk about anti-white bias, by all means go ahead, but I won't here. Still a small channel. That they wish to actually push that narrative and to suggest that just some protesters did not appear to follow social distancing guidelines. And how the hell, if it's supposed to be so bad that Dominic Cummings, with his comings and goings, is supposed to be such an evil man for putting so many people at risk for their lives, that these people here Maybe 3 arrests are justified, but they remain in police custody for questioning, so maybe they're not. And yet, if you care so much about the 2-meter rule, and then bring up such an uproar when some conservatives say, yeah, I know other countries say 1 meter, but maybe 1.5 meters is okay, because then we can raise the amount of people that hospitality services can actually serve people, then I'm going to have to question your motives. So, did you want to come in?
I just think that the lockdown really exacerbates people just deciding to do things like that.
Yes, that people have been locked in so much that when the smallest thing comes up and they think that they can get outside and mill about with other people, then of course they will take that opportunity. How many people actually here support what they're protesting against? Who knows? And the counter protesters, of course, they can't be seen because they never can, because that is what the media reports on. But as we've seen in America, where they're trying to suggest that, it's just peaceful protests, they're not damaging anything. They would say we've seen 6 people dead. We've seen 16.
I've seen so many people being punched and just bleeding on the ground, just from videos shared on Twitter.
Yeah, so
insane.
As a response to one person being supposedly killed by police, I say allegedly, but it seems like he's been charged with it already, that then you've seen half a dozen people actually killed without a doubt. That it then comes down to, these people are breaking coronavirus lockdowns, in which case we're expecting a spike, surely. And if we don't see one, it seems as if the lockdown has been useless, and almost as if we're going to see more people killed by this than the lockdown itself, just like we saw in the Detroit riots a couple of decades ago. And it's always the same reason, that they don't actually care about the fact of the things. It's all about their principle. It's all about pushing their own agenda. And that is why they will always support the people that they think, but they're saying the right things. We don't actually care about their actions. We care about the principle. It's like the old dictum that there are no bad actions, there are only bad targets. And that seems to be exactly the same thing here. That is what the BBC are pushing as well. Despite Black Lives Matter having absolutely no place whatsoever in the UK, they have no grounding for reality, nothing at all to try to suggest that they are a worthwhile movement. And yet, of course, they propagate their myths, they continue to support them, and they suggest they are a worthwhile group that should be listened to, despite every single evidence to the contrary.
Let alone manipulating white people into hating their own race as well.
And that is, of course, why we see a load of the protesters also being white people, because it's all about that white guilt. And that is why you've got to support them, because otherwise you are clearly a secret white supremacist. And if you don't come out virtue signalling, then you are clearly just the evil white man.
Complying.
Because silence is compliance.
But the thing is that you can't even reason with people like that, because obviously it will just turn very aggressive very quickly, just because you have an opinion that doesn't support that everything that you've seen is just completely racist and the whole world is full of white privilege.
And following on from that, as they have to be seen to be protesting, we've got at least 30 cities, they say, and there have been arrests in 22. And to try to suggest that these are just protests, as we see here, as fire burns in Los Angeles, for example, which has nothing to do with it whatsoever, because you have a state system. It isn't a federal overview, but instead it is down to states, and then down to the cities. They're trying to suggest that burnings in Los Angeles are at all related is completely asinine. It's ridiculous. It's stupid to possibly suggest that this is an appropriate response to George Floyd dying. And I'm going to stop saying he's been killed, because it seems much more likely that he died. And it's as simple as that. So at that point it comes down to saying, well, martial law seems to be a responsible reaction, because the vast majority of people don't wish to take place in these riots, and instead they wish to be able to defend their own property. And I know that Count Dankula has a good Mad Lads video up on roof Koreans, if you want to look into the LA riots from a couple of decades ago, that it's the individual people, it's the small business owners that are most affected. It's not the people who have the big insurance because they're chain restaurants like McDonald's or Walmart, but instead it's just down to the small business owners yet again, just like the same ones who have been affected by the coronavirus lockdown. For whatever reason, it almost seems as if the left the ones who are very closely aligned with communism and lobbying and big government and controlling the means of production, are
and
supporting.
free TVs for everyone.
Back to
Sorry.
looting. Thanks. It almost seems as if those people are supporting the huge companies that are therefore against the smaller businesses in order to try and make their own way, and as if they're trying to control everything, including the means of production. It almost seems as if the media is left-leaning and trying to get control of the means of production and stop any dissenting opinion and competition, which is exactly the world that Stalin envisioned in the 40s, which far back as the 30s because he died in March 1953, into the USSR. That seems to be exactly what the media is pushing. And if the totalitarian, authoritarian, communist, far-left regime isn't left-wing, then I don't know what is. But have you got anything to add, darling?
No, I think that's pretty good.
Then thank you for watching, and that's it from me, as this continues on and we see no sign of capitulation until it seems like a violent crackdown is a necessity, because the officer has already been charged with third-degree murder, which does seem a bit much, but nonetheless that's what he's been charged with.
And is under investigation.
So we'll go with that if necessary to appease the rioters, but we don't want to appease them too much, otherwise it suggests that rioting is a worthwhile activity, and it evidently isn't. So,
but it's also being encouraged. Actually, I watched this thing where police actually leave bricks to prior to protesters coming out, so that they're like, "Oh, look at these bricks. Wonder what I can use them for." So it seems like it is actually supported by forces as well.
So now we're going into conspiracies.
Sorry, this is for another video, I guess.
I do. Yes, as we've seen, someone being stoned, for example, by those bricks being thrown. But try to get onto the main narrative of things that we know is definitely true. At least we'll come back to your conspiracies later. That it does seem that you have to crack down, otherwise they will continue, because they don't know what they're rioting for anymore, and instead they're just opportunistic instead of doing things on principle. So we're hoping this will die down now, given that Derek Chauvin has already been charged with third-degree murder. There is nothing more that can be done for him. Third Precinct, of course, has already been burned. That for anything that is directly responsible, it seems that has already been responded to. At this point, you're going to have people who want martial law in order to take control of things, and they're going to be more drawn towards right-wing and Donald Trump for being able to establish order back from people who lost it because of the riots. And that's what we're going to see. And as far as I'm concerned, this is only going to help Trump in the November election. And I guess I'm cautiously optimistic for that. But that really is all. So until next time, as always, have a good one.
And good night.